The ballroom glittered under the chandeliers as laughter echoed through the Grand Pavilion Hotel. It was their son Jason's wedding, and Eleanor Briggs had spent weeks perfecting every detail. The champagne flowed, the music soared, and 200 guests clinked glasses in celebration. Then Gerald, her husband of 35 years, stood and tapped his glass for silence. He smiled broadly and said, "I've decided to start a new chapter without you." Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor sat perfectly still, the eyes of friends, family, and strangers locked on her, expecting tears, maybe a scene. Instead, she stood, lifted her glass, and offered a toast. "To new beginnings," she said evenly. Then, without breaking stride, she walked to Gerald's table, placed a sealed envelope next to his cake, and leaned in. "You'll want to read this in private," she whispered. What no one saw coming was that Eleanor had been planning this moment for months. Before the ballroom toast, before the whispers, Eleanor Briggs had spent decades as the quiet force behind her husband's empire. At 60, she was the woman everyone admired, refined, graceful, and always perfectly composed. Gerald Briggs was the face of Tarnwood and Vale, a corporate titan. But it was Eleanor who polished that face to shine. While Gerald charmed shareholders, Eleanor charmed senators, donors, and charity board members. She had given up her promising career in art history to raise their children and elevate his image. She hosted fundraisers, penned speeches, coordinated media events, and ensured no scandal ever saw daylight. Gerald credited her publicly, but privately, he grew colder as the years passed. 6 months before Jason's wedding, Eleanor decided to surprise Gerald with lunch at his office for his birthday. She wore his favorite blue dress, brought his preferred bourbon chocolates, and walked in unannounced. His assistant, a 20-something named Kelsey, jumped when she saw Eleanor. "He's in a very important meeting," she stammered. Eleanor smiled politely and left, but her gut told her the truth. That night, she went through the credit card statements, jewelry purchases, hotel charges. One stay was during a supposed business trip to Denver. The jewelry store, a boutique specializing in custom engagement rings. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't cry. She planned. She called her older brother Robert, a forensic accountant who had helped uncover embezzlement in 2 high-priority cases. He didn't ask many questions, just said, "Email me everything." Within a week, Robert confirmed that multiple purchases Gerald had claimed as business expenses were actually tied to personal use. Worse, the Hope and Future Foundation, which Gerald had recently promoted as Tarnwood and Vale's philanthropic partner, had no public filings, no registered charity status, and was traced to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Next, Eleanor contacted Victor Salazar, Gerald's former business partner and co-founder of the company. Years ago, Gerald had pushed Victor out during a sudden board vote. The narrative had been corporate disagreement, but Eleanor always suspected betrayal. Victor answered on the first ring. "I've been waiting for this call," he said simply. The two met quietly over coffee. Victor brought documents ones Gerald thought were destroyed. Eleanor brought years of corporate records Gerald had left lying around the house. Together, they pieced together a map of lies, off-the-boots transactions, dummy comprations, misappropriated funds. Victor also confirmed what Robert suspected. The Hope and Future Foundation was also linked to gifts Gerald had given a woman named Isabel Monroe. Isabel Monroe, 29, lifestyle blogger, social media posts tagged in Napa, Paris, and Turks and Caicos, all locations that matched Gerald's travel. In one photo, she wore a sapphire bracelet Eleanor had spotted on that same credit card statement. It was no longer a question of whether he was cheating. Gerald wasn't just having an affair, he was laundering money to fund it. Eleanor didn't confront him that night, or the next. Instead, she printed everything, sealed it, and began organizing her next event. Jason's wedding. Not just for her son, but for the stage it would give her. Because when Gerald stood in front of 200 guests to make his announcement, Eleanor wanted the lights bright, the room full, and the timing perfect. She wasn't going to expose him with tears. She was going to end him with grace. Eleanor kept her movements calculated. She attended events with Gerald, smiled for photos, and played her role to perfection. But behind those smiles, her eyes were trained on every detail, especially his assistant, Cynthia Lane. Cynthia was 33, ambitious, and always positioned just close enough to Gerald to seem useful, yet far enough not to draw suspicion. But Eleanor noticed how their hands would brush when passing documents, how they arrived at different entrances only minutes apart, how Gerald's phone lit up at odd hours, with messages he quickly dismissed. She had Robert trace Cynthia's financial activity. There were deposits from the shell company tied to Hope and Future Foundation, matching hotel bookings, clothing purchases, a new Mercedes leased under a business account. And then came the emails, obtained through a forgotten iCloud backup Gerald had synced years ago, to a shared tablet Eleanor still kept in her closet. The emails were clear, intimate, and damning. Gerald and Cynthia weren't just having an affair, they were making plans. Gerald promised to end things with Eleanor after their son Jason's wedding, saying it would be cleaner that way and wouldn't affect the company's image. Cynthia was already looking at luxury condos in Atlanta. "She's too proud to fight," Gerald wrote. "I'll walk away quietly." But Gerald miscalculated. He thought Eleanor's silence was weakness. He didn't realize it was strategy. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor finalized the packet with Robert and Victor. It contained a full financial audit of the shell companies, photos of Cynthia wearing expensive jewelry linked to corporate cards, and a timeline that matched Gerald's fraudulent activity. There were notarized statements, bank logs, and an affidavit prepared for the board of Tarnwood and Vale. Robert called it a nuclear file. Eleanor printed 2 copies, one sealed in an envelope labeled "Personal and Confidential," which she packed in her clutch for the wedding. The other was stored securely in a deposit box, alongside her revised will and an emergency power of attorney form. She had no intention of waiting for Gerald to make his move, but he didn't give her the chance to control the narrative. At the wedding reception, just as the band finished playing the father-son dance, Gerald tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted. He smiled, then said, "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I've decided that, after 35 years, it's time to start a new chapter. With Eleanor." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jason's smile dropped. Eleanor stood, glass in hand, her face unreadable. She calmly approached the cake table, placed the envelope beside Gerald's plate, and leaned in. "I'll want to read this in private," she said. Then she turned, raised her glass, and toasted, "To new beginnings." What Gerald didn't realize was that his ending had already been written. Eleanor wasn't devastated. She was prepared. Back in her hotel suite, Eleanor sat with perfect posture, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The chandelier above her cast soft shadows against the walls, a quiet contrast to the storm she had just unleashed. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer. "Board notification complete. Divorce petition will be filed at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Eleanor exhaled slowly. It had begun. Moments later, her daughter Catherine called. Her voice trembled. "Mom, what happened? Dad said you blindsided him." Eleanor's voice was calm. "I didn't blindside anyone. I protected myself. And I protected you and Jason." Catherine was silent for a long moment. "How long have you known?" Eleanor looked out the window. 6 months. I've been working with Uncle Robert and Victor Saladar. Gerald didn't just betray me emotionally, he committed financial crimes. I have all the proof." As they spoke, Michelle, Eleanor's best friend since college, sat quietly on the couch, offering a reassuring squeeze of Eleanor's hand. She'd flown in the day before, knowing Eleanor would need someone by her side once the curtain dropped. "Gerald thinks he's clever," Michelle said once the call ended. "But you've built this like a fortress. He has no idea what's coming." Eleanor nodded. "He thought I'd fall apart. Instead, I dismantled his kingdom." That night, Eleanor didn't cry. She reviewed documents, made a checklist of the next day's legal filings, and emailed her real estate agent to start apartment hunting. Not a temporary hideaway, but her new home, one that wouldn't carry the ghost of a man who had disrespected her in public and deceived her in private. At sunrise, Gerald appeared in the lobby, demanding to speak with her. Hotel security, already briefed, blocked him. "Mrs. Briggs has declined contact," they said. "I'm her husband," Gerald snapped. "Not yes," the concierge replied. "Not anymore." Eleanor, upstairs and freshly dressed in a navy pantsuit, watched from her suite window as Gerald fumed in the driveway. She didn't flinch. She had already moved her valuables into a secure storage unit. The safe deposit box held duplicates of everything. The trust her parents left her had been restructured under her maiden name weeks ago. By mid-morning, Eleanor was seated across from her attorney in a sunlit office. The divorce papers had been delivered. The corporate fraud packet had been sent to the board of Tarnwood and Vale with a cover letter detailing Gerald's misuse of funds, shell corporations, and conflicts of interest. "I want every trace of his control erased," Eleanor said. "Starting with my name. I'm taking back Eleanor Reynolds." Later that afternoon, she visited a boutique apartment downtown. Hardwood floors, French windows. Room for art, for books, for peace. It was hers. And as she stood in the center of that space, she didn't feel like a woman scorned. She felt like a woman finally free. 2 days after the wedding, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Olivia Jenkins, chairwoman of the Tarnwood and Vale board. "Eleanor," Olivia said, her voice steady but clipped. "I just left a closed-door session. We've launched an emergency audit. I reviewed the documents you sent. The board agrees. The financial irregularities are deeply concerning. Offshore wire transfers, shell vendors, criminal." Eleanor said nothing for a moment, just breathed. "Thank you, Olivia. I appreciate the board taking this seriously. I heard whispers about Gerald and Cynthia," Olivia admitted. "But he was always so convincing. We didn't want to believe it." "Well," Eleanor replied, "now there's no room for denial." Later that afternoon, as Eleanor was unpacking a box in her new apartment, a message buzzed through on her phone. It was from an unknown number, but she recognized the tone instantly. "You've made a terrible mistake. This isn't over, Cynthia." Eleanor stared at the message, lips tightening. She handed her phone to her attorney, who was already visiting for paperwork review. "We're filing for a restraining order today," her attorney said without hesitation. Gerald's public embarrassment, combined with potential criminal liability and this veiled threat, it's a volatile combination. "We're not taking chances." That night, Catherine called again. "Mom, I don't know what to believe. Dad says you've been plotting this with Victor Salazar for years. He's furious. Says you betrayed him and manipulated the board." Eleanor sighed, sitting at her kitchen table. "Catherine, you know me. You know how I've supported your father through everything, through building the company, the fundraisers, the charity galas. I didn't make this mess. He did. I just refuse to be silent about it anymore." "But why at the wedding?" Catherine whispered. "Jason's heartbroken." "I didn't choose that moment," Eleanor replied firmly. "Gerald did. He stood up in front of 200 people and humiliated me. I was prepared to file quietly afterward. He wanted to make a statement. I just gave him the truth." A long pause. "I don't know what to say," Catherine finally said. "You don't have to choose sides right now," Eleanor offered gently. "But don't let his lies twist your view of what actually happened." The next morning, Jason called. His voice was tight. "Mom, why? Why now? Why at my wedding? I'm getting messages from guests. They're saying it was cold, calculated." "It wasn't meant to happen that way," Eleanor said softly. "I planned to tell you both after the honeymoon. I wanted you to have that day. But your father decided to make a show of it." Jason didn't respond right away. "I get it," he finally said. "I just wish it hadn't happened this way." Eleanor felt the ache settle in her chest. Not for Gerald, but for the emotional wreckage her children were now sifting through. This was the fallout she couldn't fully prevent, the ripple effects of truth crashing through a carefully constructed illusion. She walked to her window, phone still in hand, looking out over the city skyline. She hadn't wanted to be anyone's villain. She just refused to keep playing the role of the silent wife. Whatever came next, she would meet it with clarity. She had faced betrayal with grace. Now she would face judgment with truth. Within a week, Gerald was suspended by Tarnwood and Vale's board of directors. Olivia Jenkins made the announcement at a closed session, flanked by attorneys and audit consultants. The official statement cited serious allegations of financial misconduct pending internal and federal investigation. It didn't take long for the FBI to get involved. Eleanor's dossier, complete with transfer histories, offshore accounts, falsified invoices, and photos, became the backbone of a formal case into wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Gerald's face vanished from the company website overnight. Joint accounts were frozen, and his business associates began distancing themselves. Eleanor watched from her new apartment downtown, a modest but sunlit space filled with art books and lavender plants. Catherine stopped by regularly, helping unpack and making dinner on weekends. Jason remained distant, still grappling with divided loyalties. But even he had started asking questions. "Mom," he said during a tense phone call, "Dad's lawyer says this is a vendetta, that you want to ruin him." Eleanor's voice was calm. "Your father ruined himself. I just held up a mirror." Meanwhile, Olivia Jenkins personally visited Eleanor. Over coffee, she admitted, "We failed you. We failed the company. Your evidence, it's explosive. If we had acted on the red flags earlier, none of this would have escalated the way it did." Eleanor nodded, her tone steady. "What matters now is accountability." Soon after, Gerald's attorney reached out with a settlement proposal. Eleanor would receive the house, half their assets, and generous spousal support, but only if she agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement and quietly withdraw all submitted evidence. Diana Winters, Eleanor's formidable attorney, didn't even blink. "Tell him no, and tell him if he contacts Eleanor directly again, we'll escalate." Still, Gerald tried. One afternoon, a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite lilies arrived at her apartment. No card, just a call minutes later from a blocked number. "Ellie, please." His voice rasped through the receiver. "We had a life together. 35 years. Don't let it end like this." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. "Gerald," she said slowly, "I didn't end it. You did. The affairs, the fraud, the lies. I didn't destroy you, I just exposed the truth." And with that, she hung up. Victor Salazar called her later that evening. "I've been digging deeper into Gerald's trail," he told her. "What you uncovered was just the surface. Some of his shell companies go back almost 20 years. Eleanor sighed. "I knew he cut corners. I didn't know it was a whole machine." "There's something else," Victor added. "Those surveillance photos you gave the board, the ones of Gerald and Cynthia at the villa in Belize, my investigator didn't take them." Eleanor blinked. "What do you mean?" "They were delivered anonymously. Same format as ours, but from a different source. You may have an ally you don't even know about." Eleanor felt a chill, not of fear, but of clarity. Someone else had been watching Gerald. Someone else wanted justice too. But she didn't chase the mystery. She didn't need to. Her focus remained on what mattered, finishing the legal process, protecting herself, and moving forward. Each day brought new forms to sign, new boundaries to draw. Diana filed an injunction preventing Gerald from selling any remaining shared assets. Catherine helped Eleanor create a new budget. Olivia invited her to serve as an advisor during the company's restructuring phase, a role Eleanor declined, choosing peace over proximity. She walked away from the empire she helped build with no desire to return, not out of bitterness, but out of resolve. Gerald had wanted power without accountability. Cynthia wanted luxury without loyalty. They had gambled with the wrong woman's silence. And Eleanor? She had learned that quiet didn't mean weak, it meant strategic. Now her voice was steady. Her name was her own again. And every step she took from here would be hers, fully and unapologetically. With Gerald officially disgraced, Eleanor stood in front of the courthouse and signed the last of her divorce papers. She took a breath so deep it felt like the first real inhale in decades. That same afternoon, she submitted the paperwork to legally return to her maiden name, Eleanor Reynolds. It was more than a name. It was her rebirth. Her first act of freedom was quiet but symbolic. She enrolled in an art history course at the university downtown, one she had once abandoned to support Gerald's travel-heavy career. Walking into the lecture hall, surrounded by young minds and seasoned academics, she felt a flicker of excitement she hadn't felt since her 20s. Eleanor also began volunteering at the local museum on Saturdays, helping curate community exhibits. The director, impressed with her insight and diplomacy, offered her a part-time position in donor relations. For once, Eleanor said yes, without needing to ask permission. She joined a book club that met at a cozy cafe every Thursday evening. There, over pastries and strong coffee, she made new friends who knew nothing of Gerald or the scandal, just Eleanor. Just her thoughts and laughter, no longer filtered through anyone else's image. Michelle insisted on celebrating every milestone. To freedom, she declared, raising her wine glass in Eleanor's living room. And to never wasting another breath on a man who doesn't know your worth. Eleanor laughed, deeply and fully. It didn't feel like starting over. It felt like finally starting. Inspired, she booked a solo trip to Florence, Italy. It was a dream she had tucked away for years, sacrificed to business events and holiday plans that always revolved around Gerald's schedule. Now, with her passport renewed and itinerary in hand, Eleanor stood on a cobblestone street in the birthplace of the Renaissance, watching sunlight spill over cathedral domes, and felt nothing but peace. Her children were beginning to heal too. Catherine visited often, offering both emotional support and endless encouragement. Jason, after weeks of silence, finally invited Eleanor for coffee. "I was angry," he admitted, eyes downcast. "Not because of what you did, but because I didn't want to believe it was true." Eleanor gently squeezed his hand. "We all want to believe in fairy tales, son. But eventually, the truth catches up." They didn't solve everything in one conversation, but it was a start. One afternoon, another message arrived, this time from Cynthia. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Eleanor didn't flinch. She forwarded to Diana, her attorney, who assured her they'd tighten the restraining order and document everything. Cynthia was desperate now, scrambling as the walls Gerald built crumbled around her. But Eleanor was no longer part of that world. Her resolve was unshakable. She no longer lived in fear, no longer sought validation through roles others gave her. She had forged something new, something entirely hers. The whispers at social clubs turned from gossip to admiration. News outlets quietly acknowledged the anonymous whistleblower who helped expose a multi-million-dollar fraud. Some suspected, but few confirmed. Eleanor didn't care for credit. What mattered was her clarity. The world now saw Eleanor Reynolds not as the elegant woman behind a powerful man, nor as a betrayed wife in the aftermath of scandal. They saw a woman who exposed corruption, stood her ground, and walked away with dignity intact. And most importantly, she saw herself. The fallout didn't end with Gerald's termination or the FBI investigation. It continued to ripple through the city's social and corporate circles. Desperate to salvage his image, Gerald took to quiet channels, spreading claims that Eleanor had orchestrated everything out of spite. He told anyone who would listen that he was the real victim, that she humiliated him at their son's wedding out of revenge. But the facts stood in sharp contrast. The board at Tarnwood publicly confirmed their cooperation with federal investigators. Eleanor's evidence was undeniable. Former colleagues stopped returning Gerald's calls. The business community turned cold. He was no longer the untouchable CEO. He was radioactive. Eleanor, meanwhile, kept her focus on healing. When Jason and Catherine came to visit her new apartment, there was tension, especially from Jason. He needed answers. "Why now?" he asked. "Why at the wedding?" Eleanor explained it all. Her suspicions, her investigations, the timing Gerald had planned, and the trap he walked into when he publicly blindsided her. "If I had confronted him earlier, he would have shut me out, gaslit me, hidden everything. I had to be strategic. I had to be smart," she said calmly. Catherine nodded, eyes filled with pride. Jason didn't respond immediately, but he didn't argue. He looked around at the small apartment. The warm tones, the minimalist decor, the painting of a Tuscan hillside. Eleanor had hung by the window. "You seem more like yourself here," he said at last. Eleanor smiled. "That's because I am." Later that evening, after her children had left, Eleanor sat quietly in her reading chair. The hum of the city echoed through the open window. In one hand, she held a Florence guidebook with dog-eared pages. In the other, a glass of Cabernet. The apartment wasn't lavish, but it was hers. She looked around at the half-unpacked boxes. Her favorite books now lined the shelves. The kitchen held her grandmother's teacups, items she had packed away long ago to make room for Gerald's preferences. The art she loved, the candles she chose, the scents she adored. Every detail now reflected her and no one else. She thought of the years she spent as Gerald's wife, the galas, the speeches, the carefully arranged smiles, the sacrifices she made in silence, the way she adapted herself to fit a mold someone else had crafted. And she thought of the moment she placed that envelope beside his wedding cake. A quiet declaration that she would no longer be invisible. Now she was Eleanor Reynolds again, not just in name, but in essence. The final sip of wine lingered on her tongue as she closed the guidebook and leaned back, watching the evening sky shift to dusk. Her trip to Florence was only weeks away, a dream delayed for far too long. But this moment, this quiet, simple, extraordinary peace, was its own kind of arrival. Eleanor Briggs was never meant to be the center of attention. For decades, she was the elegant shadow behind a powerful man, expected to smile, stay quiet, and keep the world spinning behind the scenes. When Gerald betrayed her, publicly, cruelly, he assumed she would shrink away. But instead, Eleanor did something extraordinary. She handed him a sealed envelope at their son's wedding, and within it was everything she needed to dismantle his lies, his empire, and the illusion he'd built for years. This wasn't just a cheating story. It was a reckoning. A quiet, deliberate act of justice by a woman who refused to vanish. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't beg. She planned, documented, prepared. And when the moment came, she stood tall and detonated the truth with one simple gesture. If you've ever felt dismissed, betrayed, or made to feel small, let Eleanor's story remind you it's never too late, not to reclaim your voice, not to rebuild your life, and not to burn the lies down to ash. If her strength moved you, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to believe in their own power. Leave a comment below if you've ever risen after betrayal, and make sure to subscribe to Veiled Fury for more true stories of deception, revenge, and empowerment. This is veiled fury, where every woman rises,